The world is big and dangerous, and there's not much reason to love it, especially if you live in a dormant jungle of glass and concrete, populated by people indifferent to everything but their own skin. In the sticky web of daytime streets and under the rays of icy neon light at night. Such was the fate of the hero of this story, searing anger and hatred toward the reality around him. What else can you expect when a child is abandoned as soon as he is born? When they treat them all their lives as if they had been raised as slaughter animals. There are not many options left. Either surrender, let everything go on its own and die, or to become stronger, clinging to the possibility of survival, and not trust people, no matter what happens. Be a loner. It culminated in an ordinary walk through the city, but it ended in a confrontation with 3 opponents at the same time. Too confident. They were counting on easy prey when they rounded up a slender kid in a dark sweatshirt. They knocked him to the ground with powerful blows that rained down from all sides. But no one expected him to get up. He wiped his bloody face and shouted furiously, attracting the attention of his opponents, who had already begun to retreat. And then he would attack and, with a series of lightning strokes, smash the smug faces of his opponents in blood and break the teeth of the hapless thrill-seekers. Even the board one of them was holding in his hands didn't help. The opponents were left lying on the asphalt, moaning while they tried to figure out what had happened, and their failed trophy put on his hood, gave the place a contemptuous glance, and walked away. But this case was soon forgotten amidst much bigger problems. After all, on January 1, 2020, the world turned into a game and was filled with dungeons, bright portals, from which all sorts of monsters began to emerge on Earth. Goblins, orcs, skeletons that suddenly came to life for unknown reasons, bloodthirsty werewolves, and even voracious dragons. Big cities were plunged into total chaos. Fire and destruction filled them with the many deaths of ordinary citizens. Bodies filled the streets. Blood poured in rivers over the once gray asphalt. And over the fires was the suffocating stench of soot and decay. It seemed that hope had abandoned this world, until divine beings began to appear in it, and they began to be called Shining Ones. The light of the distant stars emanated from the huge humanoid figures, and they themselves transmitted their power to a small group of people. Thanks to these abilities, the lucky ones learned how to destroy dungeons and transform themselves into players. People believed that the players who possessed special powers would save the world. After all, there was nothing else left but that hope. And who better to count on than heroes capable of single-handedly slaying a giant troll and thereby inspiring the admiration of the crowd? Except that the players took advantage of the chaos around them and were only busy lining their own pockets with money. And more talk about the end of the world began to circulate among the common people. But the hero of the story was not interested in talk. After all, the world as he saw it was still a place in which no one could be trusted. Until, by chance, he met Se-Jun Lee, one of the first 7 players, an invincible warrior, heir to the sacred light, and the strongest player in the world. He unselfishly helped all those who needed protection from the bloodthirsty monsters of the many dungeons. And so he earned the love and adoration of all the common people. For the sake of saving the world, Se-Jun Lee, like the hero of the legend of King Arthur, drew his sword from the stone, and with it he began to destroy the numerous evil that disturbed the peace of the commoners. The heir of the sacred light set himself the goal of destroying all the monsters the game had created, to put an end to the endless raids of the monsters, and thus save his world from destruction. Se-Jun Lee created the Messiah Guild to gather under its banner brave men who wanted the same thing. This was the first time such a thing had happened, and the hero of this story also decided to join their ranks, finally meeting people he could trust. The soldiers, led by a blonde knight in shining armor, had many hard battles ahead of them. And after the battles, the warriors, tired but satisfied with their victories, could rest in a tavern. And, looking at such a picture, the hero of this story smiled softly, feeling his own involvement in something more than endless loneliness. Together with the other members of the guild, he hoped to be able to change the world for the better. And the possibility of that was slowly approaching. For now, the guild had a final goal, a final battle, after which life could finally go back to the way it used to be. However, these plans were not destined to come to fruition. Before the fight, the hero decided to go to the Temple of the Sacred Light, where he knew Si-Jun-Lee was now, and spent time praying for victory. Chapter: The last battle is left. A member of the guild spoke softly to the leader, to which the latter indefinitely hummed, which caused mute puzzlement fellow. The last battle. Yes, perhaps it will be the last. The next second he drew his sword from its sheath and plunged it into the body of his hapless comrade in arms. The sharp metal ripped through the sturdy armor like thin tin, plunged into the body at the hilt, and ripped a desperate cry from the victim's throat. Well done, Woo Jin Kim. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have been able to accomplish all this. Se-Jun-Lee sarcastically stretched out and stepped away from the warrior, who had fallen to his knees, and then put a Balmune curse on him, and it almost completely removed the player's resilience and protection. Was it from the beginning? Have you been plotting this? Woo Jin Kim grunted with difficulty and clutched at the floor of the temple with his fingertips in rage. But why? He was answered by quiet footsteps and the voice of another companion, who suddenly came closer, and then the girl mockingly muttered, "Why? Don't you still understand? When the game ends, everything will be gone. Our power, the items, the dungeons, the monsters." After explaining her own motives to her dim-witted colleague, she approached the heir of the Sacred Light, lightly tapped his shoulder pad, and added, "The reason to honor us will also disappear." Shinhai Park. Woo Jin Kim breathed out with difficulty and looked at the girl in disbelief. She leaned toward his ear and whispered, "We can't even take over the world." Because of that phrase, Woo Jin Kim found the strength to raise his head and glare furiously at the guild members with whom he had to go through so much, and shouted the name of its head, then coughed up the black slime that hissed on the stone floor. Shinhee Park watched his suffering for a while. She couldn't hide her surprise or even delight as she began to speculate that the now unnecessary comrade in arms was really cool, since Balmun's curse had only caused the poisoning. After all, it was only enough poison for the others to cease to exist. At these words, the black-haired warrior's eyes began to flicker to the faces of the men he'd fought alongside. The men had disappeared without a trace, leaving no clue as to their fate. This made Woo Jin Kim feel wildly angry, slamming his fist into the stones of the floor and screaming that he believed in the guild members and wanted to save the world, that now he was in the way, and so they decided to get him out of the way, just like the other colleagues with whom he had risked his own life together. After that, the guild leader and his girlfriend left, and Woo Jin Kim shouted after them that the heir of the Sacred Light should at least try to make excuses for his own actions and voice them with his shitty and vain mouth. But no one would listen to him. The warrior swore and finally caught himself thinking that no one in this world could be trusted. And then he fell to the cold floor, ended his existence, and at the same time started a new game. Other people's voices were annoying. They belonged to different people, because there was no other way to explain the differences in intonation and timbre. And they weren't talking about the same things. Some wondered if it was necessary to go back to some pudge, and persisted in saying that the monsters were appearing too often. Some, no less insistently, advised me to shut up and not complain. Some, in human nature, rejoiced at the fact that they could still make money today. Others worried that their lives were at stake, and that they should be paid more for such work. Then the light at the end of the tunnel flashed in my field of vision. and it was real. And then a truck flew out of the tunnel at full speed. In the back of the truck, Woo Jin Kim suddenly came to his senses and immediately began to look around. Next to him sat the men whose voices he heard. The companions, like the boy himself, wore dark blue uniforms and body armor. Then Woo Jin Kim started groping for himself, causing the men traveling with him to sneer. And he began to think about what had happened. He was stabbed to death by Balmun, causing the brunette to depart safely into the next world. But it didn't feel like a dream at all. And then the young man remembered the place where he was now. Meanwhile, the truck driver hit the brake pedal sharply and pressed it to the floor, which caused the car to skid, and the sharp sound of tires scraped against the asphalt spread across the road. The reason for such an abrupt stop was several flaming cars, over which columns of black smoke and soot were rising. Bodies were lying around the cars. But even that wasn't the worst of it. After all, there was a crowd of orcs near the battered cars, which the driver immediately reported and ordered everyone to leave the body with their weapons at the ready. The orcs reacted to this too, and rushed to the new as they thought prey. At the same time, they roared and grinned furiously, causing the driver to shout nervously and demand that the passengers move. The men immediately began to follow orders while their commander gave a brief briefing. The point of the briefing was that the men didn't have much ammunition. Therefore, they should only fire when they were sure they would not miss. However, a few seconds later, he was interrupted by the dumbfounded shouts of the fighters. This reaction was caused by the fact that Woo Jin Kim did not wait for the end of the briefing and moved forward. Afterwards, he shot at the nearest enemy. The green-skinned monster collapsed on the pavement and poured blood from the hole in his head. Meanwhile, the brunette fired another round, which immediately found another target. The other orcs were not happy about it. They immediately pounced on the overly bold man and used their heavy clubs, but that did not save them, for the bullets were faster than muscle strength, even if it was monstrous. The last warrior of the orc squad was suddenly alone and managed only to bark something frightened. But a second later, he joined his comrades in arms, when a new shot sent him to his death. When the crackling of the machine guns subsided and the dust on the road settled, the witnesses to the orcs' massacre began to make noise. The men began talking among themselves and only stared dumbfounded at their brother, who had managed to do all the work by himself. They had never seen anything like this before that day. Woo Jin Kim himself caught himself thinking that everything around him was too real for an ordinary dream. And, in all likelihood, he was somehow in the past. The feeling was reinforced by the commander, who came up and immediately yelled at the overactive subordinate. However, the guy did not pay attention to the man and walked past him. Neither did he pay attention to the astonished exclamations of his colleagues, who were trying to understand what exactly was going on with him now. Instead, the brunette went back to the car. He settled down on some crate beside it, sighed, and plunged into his memories. The faces of Sejun Lee and Shinhai Park immediately flashed before his eyes, causing a vicious grimace to appear on their victim's face. But Woo Jin Kim didn't have time to think about the betrayal for long, because he was plucked from his poisonous thoughts by the piercing sound of an announcement that came literally out of nowhere. It said that he was now a gambler. The entire field of vision was immediately occupied by a glowing window, which shimmered in all shades of blue, with 3 possible choices of development in the game. One of them didn't get any attention, neither in the past nor now that by chance Woo Jin Kim is in it again. After all, he had never been interested in the role of an archer. He had chosen the role of stern fighter for life the last time, and became a warrior who was very skillful with sword and shield. But he didn't want to make the same mistakes again. So the brunette rejected that option as well. But he did not have a third choice before. For this reason, the young man, second to the one day he had already lived, decided to focus on this one. The role of a representative of the dark world. This role gave you the ability to control different types of curses, or use dead monsters as material and create a dark army. Unlike the other classes, it gave cheating abilities. After all, the player who followed this path could gain all the skills. The most powerful player who received the favor of the Dark World spokesman and all of his abilities was Johann George, the so-called Immortal King. At the time when Si-Jun Lee was a hero, the Immortal King was among the monsters. And in order to find this monster, Woo Jin Kim decided to choose precisely the role of the representative of the Dark World, and with a soft clicked on the right glowing window to do so. To become a monster and thus begin his own hunt. Since the emergence of the dungeons and the heroes who began to fight their spawn, various guilds began to emerge all over the world. They were commercial organizations created with the aim of gathering under their banners players who were united by one or another ideology. Of all the organizations of this kind, the Phoenix Guild stood out. It was different in that its members could get money and power in any way they had the strength to do, and at the same time do not care about the correctness of their own methods. This approach made the Phoenix the second most powerful guild in Korea, against the background of the corruption that was spreading in its ranks. The Messiah Guild made a perfect impression. The Phoenix Guild headquarters was located in a fairly ordinary skyscraper. There were plenty of such buildings in this reality. The more so since it was much more convenient to accept new recruits in an office environment. That's where Woo Jin Kim went. An important-looking man was waiting for him in the sunlit office. He immediately handed the boy a contract to join the Phoenix Guild with a quiet rustle. And then he began to tell him that every sweep of the dungeon entailed additional expenses. Brunette immersed himself in studying the documents, after which he came to the conclusion that it was clearly not enough to buy certain items that were needed for the game. But there was nothing to be done in this situation. When the young man had finished reading, he asked how he could prove his own qualifications as a player. After all, only he himself could see the windows of state, while other people had no such ability. His interlocutor grinned at this and straightened his jacket, then handed him several pages of Dark World skills. The guild candidate had to choose one of them and then tear it apart to prove his abilities. Thanks to this, the office worker got an opportunity to see everything with his own eyes. A representative of the Dark World from level 1 and up, it consisted in the fact that the blood of its owner turned into poison. Its destructive power increased along with the growth of the skill rank and the level of the player himself. Resisting the effects of the poison was extremely problematic. It was a fairly simple skill. However, when I was able to summon and work with blood golems, its effect increased noticeably. This made it an incredibly useful ability. After a moment's hesitation, Woo Jin Kim chose a sheet of paper with the hemotoxin skill on it, took it in his hands, and immediately tore it up. The office was filled with a bright flash of sapphire light, which caused the guild member to adjust his glasses again and replace his contemptuous grin with a grimace of surprise, bordering on fear. The representative of the Dark World himself saw the status window, which informed him that he had acquired a new skill. The morning after the confirmation of the player's qualifications, the boy woke up not without difficulty, and immediately plunged into thinking about the fact that he had once already ceased to exist in this world. But for some unknown reason he was reborn again, though dreams of his former life still haunted him. It was from one of these that the young man awoke. He was dreaming of his former associates and one of the many sweeps of dungeon. In the course of it, the blonde, violet-eyed sorceress had the temerity to ask another colleague, the muscular, razor-headed warrior, why Woo Jin Kim had been chosen as a bloodhound. After all, his class was not well suited for such a role. To this, the knight whispered that of all the guild, their commander had the most canine character. The girl gave a surprised exclamation. Then her interlocutor explained that the sorceress herself would see that he was right, if she stayed in the company of the commander long enough. At this point, Woo Jin Kim woke up, and he caught himself thinking that if he somehow managed to be in the past, his comrades in arms must still be alive, and he might even be able to meet them. The only question was when that meeting would happen. Meanwhile, in the Gwangmun Sports Park, another event began. In the underground parking lot of the place, guarded by armed men, 4 players gathered. A dark-haired girl, a smiling blonde in a red turtleneck, and a brunette in a gray coat. A shaved-headed man in a white shirt greeted them. He immediately asked if everyone had gathered early today. The gray-eyed young lady made a worried look on her face and spoke timidly about the fact that today was their first hunt, and that, in all likelihood, they should just trust a man named Jusup. He said confidently that this was his 4th trip to the dungeons, so the rest of the guys should really trust him and just follow him. After that, the man asked when the last member of today's hunt would arrive. The response was an unimaginable rumble. It was coming from a car that had some difficulty pulling into the parking lot. Witnesses to its appearance were dumbfounded. Unlike the other cars that had been left in the parking lot, this one was old as hell, and it kept spewing puffs of smoke into the air, as if it might just fall apart on the move at any moment. The blonde man watched for a while, and then grimaced as if he'd taken a bite of half a lemon at once, and began to reason about what the driver of the vehicle had said about this being his first hunt. But he was beginning to get annoyed by his slowness, and in general, this rookie needed to become more disciplined. At the same time, the car finally stopped, and then Woo Jin Kim, dressed in his usual sweatshirt, almost fell out of it in front of the participants of the future hike. The girl began to look at her future co-conspirator, after which she grinned contemptuously and agreed with the blonde, and then said that the kid who had come here in his wreck should be grateful that they'd let him join the outing in the first place. Also, she characterized the last car as terrible. Next, the brunette joined the conversation. He said that, judging by the newcomer's appearance, he hadn't even had time to get his guild gear, and, it seems, he decided to focus only on survival during his first operation. But then this conversation was interrupted by Jusup. The man suggested that his colleagues simply forget about the new guy, and pretend that they were missing one member. Then the skinhead began to talk on the fly about the new weapon he had recently purchased. The others took his idea with enthusiasm, followed their mentor, and left the last classmate behind. After that, the team went to the guild office, where a brief briefing on dungeons was given to its members. It was about the things that were not mentioned in the briefing. That did not matter. All that mattered was to remember the purpose of each mission and the conditions under which it was to be carried out. The location to which the newcomers were to go today was the Goblin Cave. It had to be cleared of all monsters, and when the main task was over, the office worker reminded the men to double-check everything. If any of the fighters had any questions or decided to refuse the mission, they had to say so now. If there were none, all the players had to check their equipment again. The rest of the team reacted to this advice very lightly and immediately started joking and laughing. And Woo Jin Kim caught himself thinking that he didn't know any of the players, so he didn't have to worry about any of them. Next came the command that the players could enter the dungeon, and all the players headed toward the glowing portal that led to the location they were to sweep. As they approached it, a girl excitedly rambled on about how this was the first time she'd ever seen the crossing. So close. And Jusup mockingly replied that she would be even more surprised when she was in the location itself. Woo Jin Kim reacted the most calmly to the portal. The hunt was already underway in the dungeon, where the glowing gap led. Upon arriving in the other dimension, the dark-haired girl, who was in fact a witch, exclaimed in amazement that she had indeed entered the other world, and immediately she began to look around in rapt fascination at the age-old forest in which the players had been trapped. The blonde guy, who turned out to be an archer, mumbled about how he felt like he was in some computer game. He was interrupted by Jusup, who snarled that it wasn't a game at all, but real reality. He was in the middle of a game. Woo Jin Kim, meanwhile, paid little attention to the chattering of his forced classmates. He concentrated on looking around the immediate area for traces. He found many trees that had been torn apart by someone's sharp claws, and he came to the conclusion that the entire dungeon was literally crawling with goblins. When he was done with that, Jusup called him over and offered to take a look around while the others set up camp. The young man calmly agreed and left the clearing where the other players had settled. They immediately began discussing their comrade in arms who had gone into the woods. The archer grumbled that he was sure his forced colleague was clingy, but he fell for the commander's ploy surprisingly easily, as if he didn't know how dangerous it was, and probably just turned out to be blithely stupid. The squad leader listened to this monologue for a while, but then he got bored. Then the shaved-headed swordsman grinned and talked about how they needed to be well prepared for the hunt, and then all the items they could find during it would belong only to them. Woo Jin Kim, on the other hand, didn't go far all this time, and now he was speculating that the commander's use of him as bait was entirely expected. And then the gambler grinned predatorily and began to consider his actions for the future.